Hello, and welcome to our last lecture on the Vedas and on Vedic ritual. We spent 3 weeks on this, and the reason for it is because usually really isn't treated in Hinduism courses. They'll probably just show altar of fire, and then that's it. But I think so much of what goes on in the Vedas sets the groundwork for what we'll see in later Hinduism, even if it really contrasts from what we see in the Vedas and in Vedic ritual. And as I've said over and over again, I think this is a necessary corrective to the contemporary Hindu argument that everything that is done in modern Hinduism comes right out of the Vedas. As we can see, and as we'll see as the class progresses, not a lot of Hinduism looks like the Vedas. So here's our last push into the Vedas, and today we're going to be talking about contemporary practices of the Vedas. So I've entitled this lecture, Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Vedic Ritual But Were Afraid to Ask About Contemporary Vedic. Why do I use that? Well, there's a famous old book called Everything You Wanted to Know About Sex But Were Afraid to Ask, and I've always wanted to make a joke about that in a lecture title. So now I have, and I'm happy about it. Okay, so let's remember a couple of ideas before we move forth. Vedic ritual is highly ritualized, and it has daily rites, seasonal rites, and intermittent rites, so rites that you do occasionally, but there's also these big grand rites that require a lot of people and many officiants and sort of a remarkable amount of preparation, such as like the Agnicayana and the Ashvamedha. Vedic ritual does not, as I've said before, have images or deities or temples, which are the key aspects for Hindu practice today. While deities are in fact worshipped, they just don't have images. They're not worshipped like they're done in a puja, where someone goes before the image of the deity and makes very specific offerings to the deity, usually by waving those offerings in front of the deity. In fact, puja, which comes much later than the Vedic rituals, is actually derived in the Tantras and to some degree the Puranas. So in many ways, contemporary Hinduism is far more tantric than it is Vedic. Is a big argument. So we do see Soma, the divine drink, and God in the ritual, and we also see Agni in the ritual. But all the other gods are thought to be there. That's the thing. All the gods, every time you do these rituals, are thought to be invited as if guests to a feast. So while there are not images, and you can only see Soma and Agni, all the other gods are thought to be there. There are three groups we're going to be looking at that we have looked at up to today. We have David Knipe's book, which is called Vedic Voices. And that one is in Andhra Pradesh. So you can see that all the way down in the southeast. And is in fact a group of brahmins from the Godavari River Basin. Then you have down in Kerala, my favorite state in India, I love Kerala. You saw Altar of Fire, which was by some Nambutri Brahmins, and that was written up in a book called Agni by Fritz Stahl. He was one of the gentlemen you saw in the video. He was also a hell of a surfer. He died a little while back, and we are much lost without him. And finally, we have Larios Borayan put out a book relatively recently called Embodying the Vedas, about Vedic recitation schools in Maharashtra. Now, for Borayan, he found that there was a different model of education. So in Altar of Fire, you saw the son being taught by the father. That would be the same way that these Brahmins in Andhra Pradesh were taught. Here in Maharashtra, over in the west of India, Borayan found that there were almost like Veda high schools that people would go to learn their Vedic literature and to some degree the ritual lore. And these Vedic Brahmins, for the most part, would serve as priests, so not doing Vedic rituals, but they would have the background and then possibly perform Vedic rituals on their own. So with these three data sets, we can observe the living Vedic tradition that not long ago in the academy, we thought just didn't exist, had all died out. When I was first taught this material 20 years ago, it was like, there were these guys that did it in Kerala, that's it. But we know that there are Vedic Brahmins throughout these three areas, and quite a few of them in Nepal as well, though I haven't made any contact with them. So as I was saying before, these practitioners are not solely Vedic, so they'd be very much Vedic in their own homes, but many of them would also choose to be what are called Smarta Brahmins. A Smarta Brahmin is a Brahmin who does the ritual based on the Smritis. Remember those words? What's written, what's remembered. So these would be Orthodox priests that work in temples performing rituals there. As we move forward, I do want to make one overall statement, and that is about ritual and ritual imagination. I study ritual a lot in my research, and one of the key aspects to studying it is, if you can't observe someone doing the ritual, is to engage what I call the ritual imagination. And so you read through these rituals instructions, and you imagine how they would work. You imagine putting yourself in the role of the different priests, you imagine yourself in the enclosures, and you try to get a feel for it. And I found that when I really think through ritual texts like that, I can almost like get my brain to the spot where I can start thinking like someone who would be doing these rituals, but also seeing the logic of the ritual. If I just read it, I don't get it. I have to really imagine things. And then suddenly little holes in the text start to make sense because I think about the logistics and the physicality of it. So let's quick review. We have 4 major scriptures, these sanitas or collections. So these are our earliest Vedas. We have the Rig Veda, which is the oldest. It's the Veda of the hymns. It was composed in the northwest of India, in the Punjab, in a sort of archaic Indo-Iranian language. So it's the oldest and most archaic of the Vedic Sanskrit sources. It's a collection of hymns, and those hymns are dedicated to such gods as Prajapati or Brahman, the progenitor, Indra, the great hero, Soma, the holy drink, and Agni, the fire. Then we have the Yajurveda. The Yajurveda is a description of ways to perform the rituals that are described and make use of the Rig Veda hymns. The Samaveda, or some people call this like the Melody Veda, the Saman Veda. This is all of the instructions for correctly reciting the hymns of the Rig Veda in the rituals that are explained in the Atharva Veda, or in the Yajurveda. And then finally, we have the Atharva Veda, the 4th one, which isn't like the other texts because it has a whole lot of different types of rituals that are like magical, they're about auspiciousness, they're about warding off witches. Some people say the Atharva Veda is filled with black magic. It's got a little sort of aggressive magic in there, but not a lot. What you see is there's a wide range of hymns and rituals to support the other 3 sources. Now, one thing I wanted to make clear here is a little bit of lore about the Vedas. The Vedas are apaurushaya, which comes from the Sanskrit term apurusha, no person. So apaurushaya means it's unauthored. The Vedas are the sound of the universe. They are naturally occurring everywhere. I said before that one of my first teachers would say it's like a radio signal, and some people are able to tune into the radio signal or not. They're only recently written texts. Traditionally, they were transmitted orally from teacher to student, and those teachers and students were usually fathers and sons, though occasionally uncles and nephews. And on the odd occasion, they weren't related, but that wasn't very often. Now, these texts are considered to be what's called Shrute. Shrute is like the revered mantra sounds. So that's different from smriti, which means what's remembered or written down. So one way I like to think of it is you read smriti and think about it. You chant Shruti. So it's the divine revelation. It's revered. And because it's universal and personless, that means there's a sort of science to hymns and to these rituals. So who can study these and who can hear these? Well, the twice-born folk, who would be the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, and the Vaishyas, are those who were taken in it. They've taken an initiation. Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas take specific initiations at different parts in their life, so they're a part of sort of overall society. Shudras, the laborers, are not initiated in the same way. So only the twice-born, these top 3, are allowed to hear the Vedas, but the Brahmins are the main learners and the main ritualists. So we have a few extra Vedic texts. Oh, I do need to make this distinction here. Like I was talking about, Shrauta, blah, 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 blah. You'll also see a distinction between a group of texts called the Shrauta Sutras and the Griya Sutras. Shrauta Sutras are those rituals that we're going to look at today, those big public rites. And the Griya Sutras are domestic rites, so little rites to do around the home. That's including like life cycle rituals like marriage, funeral, first haircut, baby's first solid food, that type of stuff, and sort of rituals and instructions for doing domestic rites. So there's a little overlap there with the Agnihotra. All right, so there are, on top of the Sanitas, those 4 main Vedas, we have some other types of Vedic scriptures. The first is the Brahmanas. Now, we talked about these before. These are texts that explain the Vedic Samhitas. They fill out all the ritual details, but they also include lore that is expounded in narratives. On top of the Brahmanas, you have the Aranyakas. It literally means the forest texts. These contain sort of secret lore and interpretations of the ritual and some philosophical speculation. They're rarely studied. Finally, you have the Upanishads. Now, Upanishad means something like sitting down nearby. Think of it as a guru speaking to his or her, usually his, students. So here you have you have ritual speculation, but there's also a lot of philosophy. Now, this last group, the Upanishads, are a body of texts that have so much philosophy in them, and really they're charming texts. They've been translated a number of times. So when we're looking at Vedic ritual or Vedic literature, and this is right at the end, that like the Upanishads are like late Vedic. That's one text that Westerners really know. Westerners don't know the Ayurveda, but the Upanishads are well translated and well represented in writing about India and Hinduism. So the main texts for these Vedic practitioners are ritual-based sources that explain and expand the Shrute. So all of these, the Brahmana, the Aranyaka, and the Upanishads, are still kind of considered Shrute, but they are expansions on the Shrute. They explain what is heard, what has been revealed. Now, so the text that we are looking at for the rituals we're looking at would be called Shrauta rites or Shrauta sutras. Shrauta comes from Shrute, so Shrute, Shrauti. There you go. So the Shrauta Sutras are the discourse on understanding the Shrute. Now, our coastal Brahmins here that we're reading about, they actually maintain and study the Taittiriya Brahmana and its connected Aranyaka. So the Taittiriya Aranyaka and the Taittiriya Brahmana. So remember, Brahmana expands the Shrute. Which Shrute? The Yajurveda. What does the Aranyaka do? It goes even further, explaining the Taittiriya Brahmana and further on the Yajurveda, but like with sort of like secret lores about them. Now, they also maintain a text called the Upastamba Shrauta Sutra. So that's a Shrauta Sutra that is also connected to the Yajurveda. Why do I go through this? See how these terms of scriptures actually work. Now, these Brahmins would have studied this extensively, memorized tons of these texts, and considered to speculate on them. But in their lineage, these are the main Vedic texts that they study. So Vedic texts, Vedic rituals, I mean, when we read about them, are pretty extensive. Now, these rituals are really rarely practiced today, but Indian literature is filled with descriptions of their performances. And in fact, we'll see that, for instance, like the Ashvamedha and the Agnicayana are performed by the heroes in Hindu epics often. So here's a quick review. Agnihotra. Sorry, I was a little parched. Agnihotra is the daily performance of hymns at sunrise and sunset to preserve and maintain the world and also to bring prosperity. We'll look at the details of that today. The Agnistoma is the praise of fire and the pressing of soma. So soma is the sacred stalks that are pressed and processed to create the sacred drink. Agnistoma rituals are actually the building blocks of the next two big rites, which we've looked at in detail so far. Agnicayana is a sequence of Agnistoma soma pressings and animal sacrifices that are also accompanied by the building of a large brick bird. That brick bird is thought to be used to perfect the soul of the sponsor of the ritual. Finally, the Ashvamedha is an imperial rite in which a king sacrifices a horse to consolidate and expand his power. So the Agnihotra is a domestic rite. So that's the one ritual that's just done in the home by a Brahmin and his wife. The other two are the so-called solemn rites. They're done in public. They require a lot more people. They're not performed in the home. So what are some elements of these rituals? We've already seen that soma is this sacred libation that is essential to all of these solemn rites. Soma is used in the Agnicayana, the Agnistoma, and the Ashvamedha. Now, the actual plant has been lost, and it's been lost for a long time. In Andhra, they have a specific type of like creeper plant, so like a viney, ropey plant called tiga, which is pounded and pressed to make a really bitter, gnarly beverage. Evidently, it doesn't taste very good and is no longer intoxicating. In the past, it was thought to give visions, to make people brave, but also crazy if they have too much of it. They're said to have a sense of like flight. So think of it, you consume this beverage ritually while looking at a giant brick bird, and then you feel a lightness in your body, and you can think that, yes, I am ascending to heaven like that great brick bird. In fact, Indra, the god in the past, was thought to be addicted to sacrifice and addicted to soma, so much so that he would get ragingly intoxicated with it, and hijinks would ensue. Now, it's been posited that it could be booze, that it could be cannabis, that it could be psilocybin, but we're never going to know for sure. And I've read through so many of these arguments. I mean, I find none of them compelling. So I think it's just a plant we lost. I don't know. It could be datura. I don't know. Maybe datura. I don't know. Fire. The fire is sacred. And one of the reasons why I'm going over these elements again is because we talked about them in principle in the last lecture. But in this lecture, in this reading for today in David Knipe, we've actually seen people describe how they do these rituals and how they relate to these rituals and how they think about these rituals. Now, Agni is, of course, a god, but it is also the physical fire. The fire is sacred. And all fire is sacred, which is why you don't want to blow out the birthday candles on your birthday cake, because you're spitting on God, and that's a bad idea. But the thing I want you to think about is fire is not singular. Each specific fire is an individual in the Vedic worldview. The fires are living creatures with individual identities. The Vedic Brahmins would have up to 5 sacred fires constantly going, with functions that range from cooking food to ritual. There's even a special fire that is maintained for consuming sacrifices and consuming corpses in a funeral context. There are different fires, and they have different purposes. Much of the Vedic practice involves maintaining these fires, keeping them lit, and then keeping them pure. Now, how do you keep them pure? By only having them do what is required on their function. You know, it's like if you were to light a cigarette off the Agnihotra fire, well, not only would they probably break your fingers, but that would be considered incredibly unholy and impure, because you would be using that specific fire for a different function than it was consecrated to do, than it was meant to do. So the sacred fire that one finds in a Brahmin's home is either brought from another sacred fire from a family nearby that has the proper lineage for maintaining that fire, or it can be specially created, and they have rituals about this, using a fire drill. We saw this in the Ultra Fire video. So in which sort of the male drill is put into the female base, and it's rocked back and forth, and they use ropes and whatnot to create enough friction that'll kindle a flame. That new fire can be made into the Brahminical sacred fire in that way. Yes, so another way, I mean, there's obvious sexual resonances there, but there is sort of an idea that the base of the piece of the wood the fire come out to is considered a womb, and then obviously there's phallic references to the fire drill. I should have had a picture of the fire drill on there. Sorry about that. So one of the first tasks in the career of a Brahmin, a Vedic Brahmin, is to establish that domestic claim. They can do this at any point in their life. Some do it quite late in their life. Some do it quite early. A small minority of Vedic Brahmins actually maintain these fires. The majority of Brahmins don't do this. And if they do, maybe it's just the Agnihotra. Very few will go and perform the different soma sacrifices that we'll go over in just a second, let alone, and even fewer will do a big ritual like the Agnicayana. In a family, the eldest brother must first establish his sacrificial fire before the siblings do. This fire, whew, hold on. Yeah. So the fire, so the eldest brother has to do the fire first, then the siblings can do it. So there's a sort of like primogeniture for the fire sacrifice. The fire is settled, adhana, in a special room with a special set of specially shaped sort of clay hearths where the fire will live and will be used. Okay, the three. Yes. So these flames will be carefully preserved, and at night they'll burn them down to a coal, and they have specific rituals and techniques to make sure that fire burns overnight so they can use that fire to kindle their flames in the morning. So much of Vedic life is about these fires. Now, sometimes you might need to move your fire. Some groups make allowances for traveling for that by you can put the fire in a special receptacle. Some argue, and this is contested, that you can install the fire into a piece of wood, that when you light that specific piece of wood, that the original fire that you put in the wood comes out of it. That's debatable. I'm sure there are people out there that say that there's a fire mantra you can use to carry around inside of you to travel with the fire. In fact, Vedic Brahmins, and this is something really insightful to me that Knipe brings out, regularly they'll describe having mystic visions in, of, and around the fire. So the fires also transfix them, and they have sort of mystic insights, and they have like a powerful connection to that fire, the physical fire that they see identical to God. Now, among these Brahmins, like I'd said, they do have kind of careers. So we don't have any temples in the Vedas, and we see that these Vedic Brahmins doing Vedic rituals don't go to temples, but many Vedic Brahmins will earn a living by performing ritual services in temples, even doing pujas. That's what sort of Smarta Brahmin would do, a Brahmin who does the Smritis. He would be in the same lineage, but he goes and he works in a temple every day. So if you're not working for a temple, these Brahmins have to live, and so they get donations from wealthy landowners. They'll get tax support somewhat from a kingdom. There's some discussion of maybe in the future the government will give them sort of a support. It's hard to say. But these Brahmins are cagey and they're clever. So one of the things I've noticed is some of the more Vedically pure Brahmins will find ways to demonstrate their Vedic expertise in non-Vedic situations. So sometimes people will have them do all sorts of different rituals. And by virtue of them being these very pure Brahmins, it's thought that those rituals are more powerful. Their authority and purity is unquestioned. Now, traditionally, a Brahmin would live with his teacher in what's called a gurukul. So a gurukul means something like family of the guru. You'd stay at the guru's house. And the teacher was often his father or his uncle. These days, Brahmins are also trained in these small sort of schools, and Barayan writes about this, called Veda Patashala, which means the place where the Veda is read and recited. These new schools mostly prepare Brahmins to work as temple priests, even though they are imparted with all of the traditional Vedic lore. These days, you can even find a few Vedic Brahmins in the West, even though traditionally in the Vedas, they say that if you're a Brahmin, you lose your ability to even be a Brahmin if you cross the Kalapani, the black waters. The Brahmins in Knipe's ethnography were all trained in the family clan network. But what's exciting to see is out of the research of people like Barayan to see new generations of Vedic Brahmins that are maintaining these old ways, but are finding new ways to transmit the lore. When you're doing a Vedic ritual, you have a bunch of people. We saw that there were 4 main priests in Altar of Fire who were doing any of the rites. So let's go over those real quick. But first, let's review the Yajamana. Yajamana means one who sacrifices. So you have the Yajamana and his Patni, his wife. These two are the sponsors of the ritual. They are initiated and consecrated at the beginning, and then they observe most of the ritual. They don't actually do any of the acts, but they receive all of the benefit of the ritual. They get the good merit of the ritual. So when you hear Yajamana, think sponsor. Then you have the Hotri. So this is a priest who is an expert in the Rig Veda, and he is the reciter of hymns. So when you watch this, you'll actually see him kind of speak, but then you'll have another priest who actually sings the same hymns in a different manner. The Advaryu is a character who is an expert in the Yajurveda. To no surprise, that's the ritual Veda. He prepares the space and performs the specific discrete ritual actions. The Udgatri, who's associated with the Samaveda, the Veda of all the melodies, he sings what the Hotri has sort of spoken. And finally, you have the Brahmin, who is an expert in the Atharva Veda, but he's also thought to know all the other Vedas, and he is silent, and he's just looking to find if anybody makes an error, so they can do a ritual to fix it. So he's kind of like checking everybody's work. Like I said, the Patni, so a Yajamana, to be a Yajamana, a consecrated Yajamana, has to have a wife. Now, the wife of the performer is always present in these ritual actions. Sometimes she accompanies his ritual acts. Sometimes she even does additional acts. Any priest must have a wife. We are only starting to be able to understand the role of women in these rituals by really just trying to turn to the scriptures and turn to the observations to try to figure out what's going on. If you just look at the base level of these rituals and these texts, you'd think there's no women there. But in fact, in practice and by careful reading, we're seeing that we think there might have been more women being involved than one would think. And we saw some intriguing points in these rituals that were described by Knipe, in which the wives would have a much more active role. Okay, and then finally, the Purohita. Now, the Purohita is a ritual officiant who works for a client, usually a king. In the past, the Purohita would be the main priest who would do all of the king's, necessary priestly tasks. He would also advise the king on military, ritual, magical, and political matters. These days, you'll hear the term Purohit used for any priest who is considered venerable, who's considered a good priest, who's performing large rituals on behalf of a client. All right, let's get into these rituals. Boom, boom, boom. All right, the Agnihotra. Maybe we should have started with the Agnihotra, but here we are today. So the Agnihotra is, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe a number of rituals here, and you'll notice that they build upon one another to create sort of almost like a box, to create a system of increasing complexity. So the Agnihotra. Agnihotra is the daily ritual to the fire and to the sun. Now, the sun itself is considered that greatest of all the fires. It is performed at sunrise and sunset. It's performed in the home, at the hearth, at the burning place within the home. Now, let's remember that the Agnihotra fire, that specific fire, has been installed in a Brahmin's house in a ritual called the Adana, the placing of the fire. And as I said before, that either a new fire is drilled, is created, is kindled in a very specific manner with a fire drill, or it's brought from another Brahmin's home. In the morning, the offerings are to Prajapati, the progenitor, the father of us all, who's somewhat identical to Brahman, and to the sun. So in the morning, you greet the sun rising. In the evening, it's to Agni and Prajapati. Remember, in the evening, the sun has kind of gone down. So you'd be offering to the fire, which would be the main source of light. So arguably, the fire and the sun are analogs of one another in this ritual. Now, a milk offering is made to the god Agni, who is present in the sacred fire. And it is often said that if there is a day when no Brahmin has performed the Agnihotra, then the sun will not rise. Another purpose of the Agnihotra is to just feed the fire, as if the fire consumes these dairy offerings because it's hungry. Now, one pours milk from a ladle into the fire, and the leftover milk which is called uchishta, the leftovers, are consumed by the husband and wife who perform the rituals. The priest performs these rituals as long as he is able, as long as he's physically able. When he is infirm, when he can no longer physically do the actions, he may continue to do the chantings of the ritual while his wife does the actions. This ritual is thought to maintain the universe and also to remove any sin or dosha from a family. Some argue that Agnihotra protects the family and that there is no death or misfortune to those who perform the practice properly and maintain it. Yes, as I said, one does the ritual until one is physically unable, though in fact, we have some evidence of priests who are physically unable completely and could not even stand up to do the rituals, but they would still chant the mantras, even lying in their beds, to maintain the Agnihotra practice. Now, there are some other rituals that build out of the Agnihotra. These are also domestic rituals. These are rituals for the new moon, for the full moon, and for the marking of the 4 seasons. So what I want you to see here is that there is sort of a cycle and rhythm of life that is dictated or reflected in these rituals. So the rituals are performed according to the lunar cycle, to the new and the full moon, i.e. every 2 weeks. This ritual is domestic, but it requires more participants than just the husband and wife. You have to have all 4 priests, the Hotri, the Atarva, the Udgatri, yes, so you have to have all 4 priests. Now, I want you to think a little bit about this calendar. So Hindus maintain both a lunar and a solar calendar, but most of their rituals tend to be dictated by the lunar calendar. Offerings are received in these different sequences of seasonal rites to, they're done to Indra, to Prajapati, to Soma, and Agni, but also to the ancestors, the so-called faceless dead. So all of the humans who have come before us within our family. And there's also a few rites to goddesses, and we just don't know that much about these rituals or these goddesses. Now, these rituals are not terribly complicated, but they're filled with a lot of interesting meanings. We don't really have time to go over them today, but they're in your readings. So there's a lot of sexual interpretations of sort of like the brushes being like Ravana's or Brahman's mustache, and the altar is, of course, female. So you can see that there's some sexual resonances when you're talking about running a mustache over a female altar. You can do the math yourself. But this shows that fertility, and the fertility is a main concern of these rituals. Now, in addition to these daily sort of Agnihotras and these moon cycle rituals, there are other rituals that are done every 3 months to note seasonal changes. So that's the hot season. I clearly wrote hat season. So that's the hot season from March to June, and oh my, is it hot. Monsoon from July to September, when the heat breaks and the rains come. Then you have the cold months of November to January, and spring from February to March. So there are even first harvest festivals according to rice cultivation and agrarian sort of agricultural timelines. Okay, the Agnistoma, this is the big boy. This is the one that kind of everything comes out of. So how much okay. So the Agnistoma means something like the praise of Agni, the praise of fire. Now, this is an intermittent ritual. It's not done regularly. It's the next phase up. It's a non-domestic ritual. It's what we called a solemn rite, an occasional ritual. It is often just referred to by the term yagya, which just means sacrifice. So generally, if somebody says they're doing a yagya, a Vedic yagya, it's going to be the Agnistoma. Now, folks aspire to do this right. Not many actually do, but we'll see that it is out of this ritual that all the other ones kind of derive. It's the building block to the other Shrauta or solemn rites. Now, Vedic folk in Andhra rarely get beyond this one. So practicing Vedic Brahmins, if they get to this one, they're pretty happy about it. It can be embellished and expanded. And to even begin to do this, you have to maintain the Agnihotra in your home for a full year. One informant said that performing the Agnistoma is like setting a deep rut so that a bullock cart might easily travel on a road. So think about it. You're on a road, and you have an ox pulling a cart, and the wheels bounce all over the place. But if you have like nice deep ruts, like on a 2-track, you can just go. So the Agnistoma is like the deep grooves out of which other things can come from. Another name for this is Jyotistoma. So that means the praise of the light. So this is a 5-day ritual, but around that 5 days, there's only one day which you press and consume the soma. Also, at the end of this ritual, you have an animal sacrifice, Pashubandha. There is an animal sacrifice here. All right, so what's the process? Well, there are 4 sheds you have to build. Yes, you have to build 4 enclosures in a specific ritual place. Now, the ritual space and the shed are measured out using specific measurements proportional to the height of the yajamana, the sacrificer, the sponsor. So what they do is they measure the height of the guy who sponsors the thing, and they go, all right, you're 1.5 meters. And then you would go, okay, that pen needs to be three yajamanas that way. And once you build it, you need like half a yajamana in and a quarter of the yajamana to the left. You'll install the fire. This is to say that there is one constant, and that unit of measurement is the height of the sacrificer, the yajamana. And then that is manipulated through sort of sacred geometry to build out everything else in the ritual space. So the measure of the sacrificer is the constant used in all ritual geometry. The measure of the man is the measure of the sacrificial space. So the yajamana and the wife sit in separate enclosures, and they only eat Agnihotra offerings. And in those little enclosures, they're thought to be like a womb-like place. They don't actually do any of the rituals. In fact, while they would be doing 2 Agnihotras every day, they don't do them during this ritual time. Knipe argues that they, in fact, are the fire, because people give all of the offerings to them and they will consume them. It's almost like the offerings are consumed by the fires outside in the ritual spaces, but also by the fire that dwells inside the yajamana. You'll see that they are tied up. You can see this guy a little bit here. You see his turban, and you see the thing around his that's not a usual sacred cord. So they are tied up with sort of sacred grasses that are like woven sacred grasses and whatnot. And finally, at the end of the rite, when they are in a glorified space, they are unbound and they can finally bathe. Yeah, they haven't been allowed to bathe this whole time in the Agnistoma, which is very un-Indian. So what we see here is these sort of themes of initiation. A lot of folks have written about this. The sponsor of the ritual and his wife are bound and put into a small place. They have a very restricted diet. And then at the end, they're unbound and all their bindings are thrown into the water or burned, and their soul is thought to be kind of recreated. So it's as if they've gone into a womb, they gestate through the ritual, and they come out anew, afresh. All right, so animal sacrifice is performed, but it's done mainly on the day of the soma pressings. So some will argue there's only one animal sacrifice on that like day that they press the soma. Others will argue that the sacrifices should be done all throughout the ritual. But what's clear is that the animal sacrifice is an essential part of the Agnistoma. And we even see amongst Brahmins today, the Nambutri Brahmins in Kerala did not do animal sacrifice. The guys in Andhra Pradesh absolutely did animal sacrifice. So in the past, there were probably sacrifices of cows, maybe even men in the Ashvamedha, but I don't think it's likely that anybody actually, I think they like to think about sacrificing humans, but I don't think they actually ever did. These days, there are only goats. In fact, Knipe writes that the goat is thought to be the animal most like a man. Their physiology is supposed to be the closest to ours. So the goat is smothered or quieted and then removed from the ritual space, and a Shudra, or laborer, is one who sacrifices, or is the one who cuts up and butchers the animal. Now, in fact, the mantras that they sing, the hymns that they are singing, are said to pacify and kill the animal, but that the Shudra, the butcher, is only there to assist in the process. A very technical move. The key offerings to the gods are the heart and the different linings of the organs. In fact, when one Andhra Pradesh Brahmin observed altar of fire, when Knipe showed it to him, he said, "How can there be a sacrifice if no one dies?" Now, vegetarians, and so he scoffed at the Nambutri Brahmins of Kerala. So vegetarians and animal rights activists are a danger to this practice because they resist animal sacrifice in any way. And while most Brahmins are purely vegetarian, they will eat meat in this context. Now, I want you to remember that animal sacrifice isn't, a crazy thing in India. Throughout villages all over India and Nepal, blood sacrifice, mostly of chickens and goats, are made to local goddesses. So what's just intriguing is to see, a creature who's not a god, or an entity who's not sort of a local goddess accepting these sacrifices. What about the soma? The soma substitute here, it's the soma is created from a vine called tiga, is brought to the ritual space by the person who harvested. This is kind of like one of the wildest parts. of the ritual, some dude shows up and says, I have got the soma. And they're like, no, you don't got the soma. And he's like, yeah, I got the soma. And they're like, how much do you want for the soma? It's like, I want this much. I want that much. And they ritually have this like argument. It's set up, it's scripted, but there's also some innovation. They finally end up buying the soma stalks, and then they like chase off the seller. Like, well, now we're going to kill you for selling us the soma. So it's fun that they have like this sort of scripted ritual battle. Definitely there's no hard feelings in it, but this is how you do things. So the stalks, these stalks of tiga, are soaked in water, and then they're beaten with stones to extract the juices. The priests, after extracting the juices, all walk around with their hands on the shoulders of others in like this serpentine-like Brahmin walk. So they all have their hands on their shoulders and they're walking this kind of wild pattern. And then finally they approach and they drink out of the special wooden cups. They do this 3 times on the one day that they do the soma pressing. They do it at the morning, they do it at the midday, and they do it in the afternoon. Especially in the afternoon, it is accompanied by feasting of cooked grains and animal flesh from the sacrifice. The ritual winds down, and the Yajamana and his wife have all the bindings that they have on them removed, and they can finally bathe. At this point, they're in a state of glory. All ritual items and remainders from this rite are then abandoned in a river, not burnt, as we saw in Altar of Fire. Okay, returning to the Agnicayana, remember we kept saying, what you just heard me talk about with the Agnistoma, that's what's going on in the Agnicayana. The Agnicayana is just like a whole bunch of Agnistomas that are kind of encased in this larger ritual that involved the building of the giant brick bird. So Agnicayana, or the piling up the fire, was observed in the video we watched, Altar Fire. Now here, Knipe actually explains a bunch of details and variations that you don't see in Altar of Fire. So I'm going to go over those really briefly because we've already seen the structure of the Agnicayana a bunch of times. So like I said, the Agnicayana builds upon the Agnistoma. It should be considered almost an elaborate Agnistoma, in fact. But most strikingly, the Agnicayana has the large brick bird that is the fire altar. Now, these bricks are actually built by someone. They're commissioned to be built. So you have to have somebody make the bricks. In some traditions, the brahmins themselves make the bricks. But the bricks aren't considered real until they've said the mantras for them. What do I mean by that? Every single brick that gets put down has a specific mantra that is said for that brick. That is how this mundane pile of bricks turns into a beautifully shaped bird, but all elements of it are not just physically built, but metaphysically built. The bird is made of bricks, but the bird is also made of all those mantras that were said with each brick to create a wholly metaphysical brick bird. The Agnicayana bird formation can have some variation in size and design, and I've seen a lot of different variations on this. But the altar is the key point to the ritual. It's the focal point to the rituals. Brahmins can sort of endlessly debate the shape and the size and the geometry, but they have ritually consistent arguments for this. The sacred geometry is sort of consistent in the process. We see that they have the same patterns of preparation, soma pressing and sacrifice, and ritual dissolution as found in the Agnistoma, because everything's building out of the Agnistoma. The bird symbolizes the soul of the Yajamana, and the performance of the Agnicayana is thought to ensure heaven after his death. Now, in fact, some folks perform the so-called water brick ritual, in which the bricks are made up of offerings of water. In this way, the ritual is mostly visualized and the actions are made symbolic, but all the chants remain. So they're doing all the chants in their heads and whatnot, and then they would pour water on the ground and say the mantra for every brick. This is kind of controversial because some purists would say, no, you got to build the bricks. And other people would say, no, I can ritually do it all in a visualized manner. This tension between physical action and visualized action comes strongly throughout the history of Hinduism, especially in the Tantras. We'll get to more of that later. All right, last ritual, the Ashvamedha. It's always good to end with a horse sacrifice, you know? So what's great about Knipe is he has so many details from the Ashvamedha that we didn't see elsewhere, but those details they are provided by him digging stuff out of texts, but he's able to ask people what they actually think and what they think actually happened or should happen in these rites. So this ritual, the Ashvamedha and the Agnicayana, is one of the most studied rites by scholars. The other rituals I've talked about are not studied in as many details. It has everything. I mean, it really does have everything. Sorry, I needed something a little bubbly. It has everything. It's got horses. It's got sexuality. It's got transgression. It has kingship. It's a grand, big ritual. And it has themes connecting to Indo-European ideas about kingship and reverences of horses. So you can take the Ashvamedha and think about horses and think about kingship. And you can do comparisons of other rituals for kingly consecration in general. So there is sort of an Indo-European connection here, even though this ritual is, in its context, is uniquely Hindu and Indian. This ritual has not been performed since the early 19th century, so it's been a long time. I don't imagine it will ever be performed again in India because of a number of reasons. One, because it's an imperial ritual that is performed by a king. You don't have kings anymore. Two, you're cutting up a horse, and that's gonna be a problem for a lot of people. Anyway, Knipe describes a very specific Brahmin who was obsessed with this rite. And he said that this guy would memorize more and more texts, and he'd think through all of its steps and try to map it out and figure out how all of the hymns would work. And in this sense, I want you to think about that ritual imagination I talked about. When I say ritual imagination, I mean thinking through a ritual and trying to put yourself in there. Addended to this is an idea called the prescriptive imagination, which I've said before. Prescriptive imagination is you can write a ritual that will never be done. It's prescriptive in the sense that you're prescribing this is the right way to do it, but you haven't necessarily done it. So the horse sacrifice is a ritual that is imperial. It's performed by a king in order to assure his rule. The king here becomes the Yajamana, although he's a lot more active than the Yajamana and the Agnicayana or the Agnistoma. Throughout Hindu literature, great kings and holy figures perform this horse sacrifice to ensure their rule and their power. Yes. The king performing this ritual goes from a mere king to a grand emperor, and they would often, upon completing an Ashvamedha, would issue specific commemorative coins for their kingdom that declared the Ashvamedha had been performed. We're going to see we will see when we're studying the epics that quite a few of the Hindu heroes there would perform this rite. Like I've said before, a horse is consecrated, and he is set to wander for a year accompanied by an army. Wherever the horse wanders, the area that the horse touches is considered under the domain of the king. There is the fear that the horse will be killed or captured, but the army protects the horse. Now, in this, I want you to think in a specific second. The king for a whole year is consecrated to do this and connected to the horse. The horse is the king. Wherever the horse goes, the king is. Wherever the king is, the horse is. In addition, the horse is prevented from copulating with any mares that he meets along the way, this white stallion. In the same way, the king is celibate for this entire year. So there's all these elaborate doublings of the king and the horse. Now, while the horse is gone, while it's wandering around, the Purohita, who's the king's royal chaplain, the king's personal priest, performs rituals to the horse's absent footprint. So they keep the footprint of the horse, and they do rituals because the footprint can stand in for the person, which is a key element in later magic, in fact, as well. The format is, again, like an elaborate Agnistoma. It has 4 priests and 4 queens. On the second of the 3 soma pressing days, the main event occurs when the horse is sacrificed. Now, these days, well, actually, in the past, you'd see that there were a number of animals sacrificed at the Ashvamedha. There would be a goat, a gael, or an ox, and a horse. And then when you really read through the text, you read about all these other animals being kind of like all over the place in the Ashvamedha. Okay, there are a wide range of domestic and wild animals in this ritual. So on the day of the sacrifice, the horse is put onto a chariot, and the king in his full armor rides around the sacrificial space. Now, do you remember when I talked about the Rajasuya, or the pressing out of the king's consecration? There he has a chariot race and shoots a whole bunch of arrows. I would say that the race is a little bit more subdued in the Ashvamedha. Okay, but on the day of the sacrifice, they kill the horse, the goat, and the ox. Then the queens dance around the horse's body while they sing bawdy songs. The rituals say that they are slapping one another's thighs and joking with the priests. The queens wash this dead horse, and then the main queen ritually copulates with the dead horse. Some people say she actually did it. Some people said she didn't. Let's remember that the horse is also the king. The horse is doubling for the king. He demonstrates the king's claim to land when he wanders around. The horse and the king are both celibate. This ritual copulation, Knipe argues, and I agree, this ritual copulation, whether done or pretended to be done, is an expression and release of pent-up energy, sexual energy, but it also ensures that fertility and fecundity of not only the queen, but of the entire kingdom here. It's almost as if the horse's sexual energy enlivens the entirety of the kingdom through its connection to the queen. This is a shocking ritual with a really strange element. There's no real analog to this anywhere else in Indian culture. Where did this thing come from? Why was it a big deal? So next, the queens stitch the cuts that are to be made on the sacrificial animals. So what they do is the animals have been killed, strangled. They take like a thick needle and thread, and they mark out, stitching into the skin, the places where the butchers will specifically cut up the horse or other sacrificial animals' anatomy. The king ascends to the throne, and the cut up horse meat is put before him. Nobody eats the horse. The horse is like the one animal that's not eaten. Is that because the horse is the king? So the king has been sacrificed as the horse. Then you have the horse flesh, which I think also doubles for the king. To consume the horse flesh would be to consume the king flesh. And that's no bueno. That's not good. Okay, so the ritual continues with a wide range of soma pressings, and then it winds down. After the ritual is over and everything is destroyed or thrown into a river, the king takes on the title of one who has performed the Ashvamedha. He's considered more an emperor than a king. So what are the implications of this horse sacrifice? This is where I close today. The ritual shows that the king has temporal power because he has the ability to just claim all this land. He can just do it. It also shows the king being wealthy because he can have all of his queens there. He can have all of the materials for the ritual. He can pull up all the priests. He can have all of the guests that will consume the sacrifices. The ritual has quite a bit of feasting. So every time they are sacrificing something, they're creating an elaborate meal that would be given not just to the people performing the ritual, but those gathering to watch the ritual, the king's substance. So, it really makes you ask, and remember, all the gods are present. They're invisible, but they're all present. It's thought that all of the gods of all the pantheons are around the ritual and are consuming all the substances that are sacrificed as well. So maybe the big question that I come to, is this an imperial ritual about showing off the king's power? Or is it about hospitality and where he can demonstrate his generousness at feeding all of his and inviting all of his subjects? Okay, that's the end. We're done with the Vedic ritual, and we're going to see something very different next. All right, it's been fun thinking through these rituals with y'all. I will see you next time.